Hi, good afternoon. Welcome to our last session, a very special session as a part of the National Center's 50th Anniversary Conference. We started this morning with a presentation, a keynote speech by Harvard University philosopher Michael Sandel. We're concluding tonight's the program today with a very special program co-sponsored by the Music Workers Alliance. The goal of this panel is to connect the issues of labor issues involving independent musicians with the issues of precarity in higher education. And so what we decided to start the program with is a special performance by Marc Ribot, a well-known musician in very many genres. But most importantly, this is actually Marc's debut at Franklin Roosevelt's home. So I know it's been his aspiration, I think, for most of his life, and so we're very pleased to be able to offer it to him. So we're going to start. Marc's going to start off. We'll start off with some music. Then we're going to have a discussion led by Larry Blumenfeld, who's a music writer and culture writer. And then we will then have that'll go on for about an hour, and then we have a reception upstairs. So thank you very much for joining us. You may want to come down from the back and come join and make it closer. And then we really appreciate everyone being in attendance. And thank you, Marc, and the members of MWA.
Thanks. And now, that was a piece by my teacher, the late Haitian classical guitar composer Franz Casillas. And now I would like to call up Sulin Hago. Oh, did you want to do it? Oh, you can say, okay. She's a friend, colleague, and comrade from the Music Workers Alliance.
See what happens. Classical too much?
Slow, solo, acoustic. Sulin can usually be heard with better metal bands around.
Yeah. I'll try to bring the metal out of this thing.
Okay, thanks for joining us. That was so beautiful and so touching that you would be tempted to say, well, what is there to say? And the truth is that there's a lot to say, and not all of it is pretty. My name's Larry Blumenfeld. If you read me writing about music, a lot of it's in the Wall Street Journal, but I assure you it's on the culture page and stuff that if Rupert Murdoch read, he probably wouldn't like. The other stuff that he really wouldn't like, I write for Daily Beast. And I used to write for the Village Voice back when there was a Village Voice, when there were pages in which talking about music and politics and the kind of issues we're talking about now could actually exist in a publication. But those days are largely gone. So yeah, we're going to talk about, it's very tempting. I celebrate these artists as artists, magicians who make wondrous things, and sometimes it's easy to lose sight of the fact that they're also workers in economies or vacuums that used to be economies, or, they make a living and contribute to either industries or collectives whatever. So a long time ago, not that long ago, I got Marc Ribot to write a piece for Chamber Music Magazine that was an urgent call for independent musicians to organize to end big tech's digital thievery and achieve economic justice. And at that point, we were in the throes of the pandemic, and he wrote, although the medical phenomenon of COVID-19 provided the final push into precarity, it is the lack of political power that brought us to the edge of the financial cliff. To have voice and power at the table where decisions that affect our lives are made, we need to organize. That's what I'm going to offer, well, Marc's words as a prelude. And rather than introduce, we want to really dive into it. So as I talk to each, Sulin, Hago, Amir, Al-Safar, Philip Golub, and Marc Ribot, I'm going to ask when you start, just maybe in a sentence, here's what I do, even though we know what you do. And yeah, maybe, Phil, I mean, I've seen these musicians organizing in something great called Music Workers Alliance. I know about Marc Ribot standing out in the pouring rain at the Google headquarters to deliver a petition signed by 5,000 musicians and others like me. Philip, maybe we'll start with you. Maybe introduce yourself, and why and how did Music Workers Alliance come together?
Sure. Well, I think Marc might actually be the better one to answer that question because he was one of the founders. But I can, before I pass it over to him, say how I got involved at least, which was fairly early on. I'm Philip Golub. I'm a pianist and composer. So I got involved basically when the pandemic hit. I started just getting on chats and Zoom and things with some of my friends, checking in with them, and someone said, "Hey, have you heard of this thing called the Music Workers Alliance? It sounds like they're already doing some of the things you're talking about here." So I wrote an email to musicworkersalliance@gmail.com with an idea, which was a very bad idea, but I didn't know that at the time. And about a day later, I got a phone call from this guy on my right, who proceeded to explain in about a 90-minute conversation why my idea was not a good idea, but there are all things we could do instead that could be really meaningful. So I guess some of us might call that the educate part of the AEIOU. And that completely inspired me, and I immediately wanted to get involved. And at that point, MWA was a new organization which grew out of some advocacy at the city and state level here in New York. But musicians were in crisis at that moment. There were, we were having these mass meetings on Zoom. Upwards of 100 people were showing up regularly. And I just quickly jumped on board, and over the course of that first year in 2020, we formalized the organization and turned it into what it is today, which is a membership organization for, or what we call a worker center for independent musicians. I don't know if you want to add to that, Marc, any of the back history.
Well, maybe if you could help define, even before and after the pandemic, maybe sketch out the basics of what are the challenges in this landscape that face all of you and your fellow musicians. What are the, Marc, can you,
Oh.
that maybe, was the impetus for MWA?
Testing, okay. Well, the impetus, I had been for a long time involved in various rank and file efforts inside the AFM, inside Local 802. And I had basically, in 2018, I had given up. There was an administration that was so hot, who are no longer in office now, but I was looking at 3 years of an administration that were so hostile to indie organizing that it was as if the various projects that we had done over the past decades to try to prove that, yes, in fact, we could be organized, and we had organized, we did organize at Knitting Factory Jazz and at Winter Jazz Festival and at Knitting Factory Records and in other places, all these efforts to prove that we could do it
and we could win on some, at least some of the time, seemed to be gone. So I was trying to say, okay, later for this for a while anyways. And I was approached by Olympia Kazi, who was the head of the New York Artists Coalition. And they had done a lot of legislative work, which involved small clubs and DJs, and they'd done a wonderful job of it. They'd won like repeal of cabaret laws and an end to the city's, the city was doing these raids on clubs and they were carrying them out. Their choices of who to raid were racist and highly biased. So they'd succeeded in putting a stop to that. And so she asked me if I wanted to get involved, and I said, I would love to get involved, but I thought that there were problems with doing an organization that represented both club owners. I love the idea of getting together with DJs, and that's one of the things that MWA has been firm about, is that DJs are musicians. We work together in the same clubs, we record together on the same records, and you know, we need unity if we're with DJs, not it's not so obvious to say all this that it's why would I even need to say it? Because there have long been American Federation of Musicians rules which excluded DJs and which still exclude anybody who works primarily with samplers. Okay, so anyways, that had been our. I liked that idea, but I thought it was a little risky to try to do an organization that involved club owners and musicians, because there was an obvious different set of interests there. And every time I'd see that go down, I could, you know, it was always dominated by the club owners, and the musicians sat there and said, yes, you know. So that was the start of MWA. And in the beginning, it was kind of very legislatively oriented, even though that is very much not my field or interest. But and it was legislatively and I said, well, we'll get around to organizing soon. We'll get around to organizing soon. And then the pandemic hit, and well, as musicians were shut down, double the Great Depression rates of unemployment. So it's hard to organize an industry that doesn't exist.
And during the pandemic, there was a great deal of aid that flowed down for the arts, but it essentially went to venues and producers, and not to the individual artist's hands. But I think if I could ask you to address for a minute, forget the pandemic for a minute, forget all of that. There was a digital revolution that, I mean, I'm not just an interviewer here, I'm a comrade, because I've been a freelance writer for 30 years, and the situation has changed drastically in the past 8 or 10 years. So the great digital revolution has killed many of the publications I write for, turned my work into something to be read on a phone, and caused each contract that I get, when I even get a contract, to take more and give less. And that's been the effect of that media. Now, can we try to capsulize the effect of digital media and streaming services for musicians? What has been the main effect of that, Mark?
Well, I think we should probably let some other.
Yeah.
Because we've all felt it, but I guess I'll just say my little bit, because I have the dubious distinction of usually being the oldest person in all of our gatherings. It's what happens if you don't die eventually. And so I can remember a time before that was true.
Right.
And it's not like everything was great,
No.
okay? But yeah, there was a huge collapse in record budgets. You know, and it was across the board. Like this myth that this only affected the major labels is a myth. I mean, okay, Sodic record John Zorn's nonprofit, which, you know, is famous for giving first record deals to interesting experimental musicians. The budget dropped from 5,000 to 1,000. You know, like another arts label, you know, I'm forgetting the name, that was linked to a major, but it was an indie that was linked to a major, that where they used to give, like the fancier version of Sodic, used to do $25,000, $30,000 budgets. They dropped to 5,000, and you know, the majors started doing these 360 deals where they basically take money from things that they never touched before, like touring income and merch, selling your records, and they chase after you, I think, long after you're even on the deal, which was never the case before. So yeah.
So yeah, let me, Sulin, you know, if I were writing critically, I would be asking you about that last piece you played, and then how it relates to some of the very different music that I heard. But let me ask you about the context for making all that music. So, what are the challenges that, you know, behind the music in terms of the business and your existence as a music worker that you face, and maybe what are some of the ways that you've tried to address them?
Well, with streaming, if we stay on
Yeah,
that
that's
topic,
a good subject.
records are still expensive to make, and like so the return being, let's say, per stream is a 0.00 whatever it is. It just doesn't. It never equates the cost that it still does take and the labor. So it's just a really huge imbalance when you consider those two things.
I mean, I'm old too, so I remember the day where the three of you would have been signed to a label, and then that label would be putting out your album and supporting your tour to support the sales of that product. But now it's sort of reversed, isn't it? It's sort of like your life as a worker is touring, and the releases are something, right? What has been the are there meaningful royalties that come from streaming for the three of you? Amir, maybe maybe you should introduce yourself and also express how you know, what are the challenges that are facing you when you get done with the artistry?
Well, I think there's plenty we can say about how pitiful the royalties are that come from streaming. They're just, there was an industry in the past where a record label would put $10 or $20 or $30,000 into an album and make 100 or more thousand in return, and the artists would benefit from that. I think the artists were always at the end of the chain, despite the fact that the artists were the ones creating all the work, and there were plenty of injustices in the system to begin with. But that has, with that income stream being reduced to rubble, to just a few pitiful cents per month or whatever it ends up being, but the cost of recording has still remained what it was. There's an obvious discrepancy, but I want to jump onto the last part of what you said, which is beyond the artistry, because musicians throughout, I mean, the recorded industry is only about 100 years old. But throughout the centuries or the millennia, we can say professional musicians subsisted on live performance. And the live performance industry is something else that we have to consider. And more importantly, there's additional roles that musicians are expected to perform today in order to exist in the world as creative performing artists. So for instance, I don't know if I introduced myself. I'm a trumpet player, Sun Tour player, composer, and I lead a 17-piece band called the Rivers of Sound Orchestra that merges Iraqi traditional music and contemporary improvisation and contemporary classical music and other forms. And in order to run an ensemble that size, that's not a commercial group, so we're not playing stadiums, we're playing performing arts centers where the capacity is between 750 and 1,500 people. Usually the audiences are, let's say, 500 to 800. But the price tag for that ensemble is $25,000. And that includes travel, sometimes hotels, sometimes not. If you add up the venue costs, we're up to between $40,000 and $50,000 to produce a single 90-minute performance. Whereas the number of people showing up is 500, let's say, paying somewhere between $25 and $50. If you do the math, there's an absolute discrepancy. And who fills in the discrepancy is these various foundations, such as the Doris Duke Foundation, Mellon Foundation, Carnegie, and others. But as a performing artist, we have the roles of being our own booking agent, manager, bookkeeper, travel agent, promoter, doing our own social media, producing our own video content, producing our own websites. So if you add up all of these tasks that end up becoming unpaid labor, that are not only unpaid labor, but are beyond the scope of what we are actually trained and spent tens of thousands of hours to do, it's an unsustainable model. And so this kind of artist as entrepreneur, or artist as being this sort of everything of the industry, where all these roles that used to be filled by various record labels, managers, producers, agents, are now falling on the shoulders of one person. And if they fall short on one of those aspects, they can't succeed or exist as an artist. So there's a larger kind of crisis that's happening in the world of non-commercial, creative, let's say, creative improvising, composing musicians and artists, that is not really being answered by the industry today. So I'm looking for answers for that question too. So
Is most of the work you do independently produced, released, independently presented?
Yeah, like my job as a musician, I'm Sulan Hago, is twofold. It's a performer, the touring band, and also a self-employed instructor. So that's like my home and travel job. And yeah, it's like what you were saying. I make my website, do the promotion, hire the artist for merch, and so there's parallels with the two, because it's all work that's unpaid on your shoulders. And I guess with the performing side, it's that's just being hired by the band, and has it's a little different, where like just flat rates. And one of the issues, because I found, is because it's so independent, like it's like since I've done this, since I was I started teaching in 2009, independent also feels a bit isolated. There's no point of reference, which I think starting being part of NWA was a really helpful thing to collaborate with people just in conversation and understand like what is a good rate as a teacher to charge, like based on my experience. Like I don't have any point of reference. And same in the performing side, like being, okay, I'm hired in this position, I'm doing all this work, learning the songs, but there's no point of reference. Like what is fair pay versus, so that's kind of my experience.
Now, in addition to Philip's own brilliant music, you had this experience recently of working closely with the great musician composer Wayne Shorter, who died recently, on the grand project that was a capstone for him, an opera. Were you surprised at the business, financial reality surrounding even something Wayne Shorter is doing at the apex of his,
Well, yes and no. There were a lot of particulars in that situation, and the piece that Larry's referring to is an opera called Iphigenia that Wayne wrote, is kind of the last large-scale work of Wayne's life. And a couple of things. First of all, there continues to be a serious problem with racism in the classical music world. And there were, many presenters and promoters and, potential partners and co-commissioners who just simply, frankly, didn't think Wayne was up to the task. What business does Wayne Shorter have writing an opera? And I think we encountered that in numerous ways along the way. I'm not going to name names, but there were attempts to partner with some major institutions, and we ended up, I shouldn't say we, I wasn't one of the producers, but the team of producers ended up producing the show independently because that was the way. We needed that independence from this world. And the other thing is that, you know, well, yeah, records are, if you think a record is expensive to make, try to make an opera. Operas are very, very expensive to make. And we encountered many people along the way who, I think there was a sense of, well, why does Wayne Shorter need money? He's Wayne Shorter, you know. But it still costs a lot of money to fly a dozen singers and spend a week workshopping and rent a space and pay the musicians and do it. And, you know, it's not supposed to, first of all, Wayne doesn't have that kind of money, nor should he be coming out of his own pocket. So we encountered that a lot. And, you know, we did get to the finish line, but it was not easy in those ways.
I want to pick up on some of the things that all of you said, which is, yeah, Amir, you made reference to, well, there was this structure in this industry, and it was rife with problems and people putting you at the end of the food chain. And yet, you know, what was commonly referred to as the man was actually somehow at the end of the day in the business of making and selling music. And the people that I used to work for were in some way, shape, or form in the business of publishing and having a publication and an audience. Now we're all mostly working for large companies that collect and sell data. And that's what they do. And whether that's a good thing or a bad thing to do, it means that we are this thing called content, which is a little like a massage therapist asking a massage therapist for a rub down. So what I mean is it demeans the work and devalues the work, and it also just, you know, the connection between audience and what you're doing, it's really just clicks now. So it is, you know, there was an education for consumers a long time ago about environmentalism. Maybe now you're going to think about the plastic. Maybe you're going to think about how it's sourced. Well, there should be some education about a generation ago, the royalties were this rate. Now they are, it was bad then, but now it is a fraction. And actually it's worth, look under the hood of the streaming service you use.
I'm technologically challenged here while I'm commenting on technology.
Right.
Can't turn on my microphone. But I think that that's very true. But I want to tie some things together that have been said. Because usually, so far, where we've got in the conversation is where these conversations always get,
Right.
which is, yes, a lot of people are not making money, and yes, it's unsustainable, what's going on. And meanwhile, people in the audience are thinking, well, okay, but what do you expect to do about
What
that?
can we do?
If it's not market, if it's not, you know, if it's work that's in the market that needs to be subsidized, let's wait until you have to, you know, get more art subsidies or something like that. What does this have to do with the purpose of this conference, which is to talk about unions? Right. So I'd like to draw attention to a couple things that people might not have noticed. First of all, people are going to be limited in what they say because this is going to be posted online. So I would just like to say that some of the issues that the people on this panel are facing are due to, you know, lack of arts funding, which, yes, it should be better in the US. It's lousy compared to Europe. It's probably not going to be better in the US because the Europeans have something called the European cultural exception written into their constitution, which creates culture ministries, and culture ministries have budgets, and believe it or not, we American or not American musicians wind up getting a piece of those budgets. But some of the work, some of the issues we're facing, in fact, there is profit being generated, and we're not seeing it. And in all of the issues that we're facing, what you're talking about, there is profit being generated by people who are not our employers. I want to bring this right back to what I really hope, Phil, that I didn't simply say your idea is a bad idea. Do my idea. I really pray I didn't do that. But
you might have.
it's possible I did. But the idea that you came in with was, we're talking about what can we do about Spotify. And my response, I hope, wasn't that's a bad idea. It's that, well, if you want to do something about Spotify, you got to deal with the hemorrhaging, the hole in the bucket, which is the fact that almost half of the world's music is listened to for free on YouTube.
Which is theft, right?
Well, in many cases, without the consent or payment, in almost all cases, in many cases without consent, and in almost all cases without the payment of the person whose music is being used. So, anyways, I redirected that fight. But the reason, without going into detail about that fight, what I want to say is that the point is that there is money being made. This is not simply a case of that there's no market. There is profit being made off our work. It's being made by digital distributors. It's being made by, well, digital and non-digital distributors. It's ad-based profit. It's data mining profit. There's more profit being made than ever before. We're just not seeing it. The answer is this: why didn't we do something about it? Why didn't we fight back? Because it's not because we don't care, in spite of the fortune spent convincing the public that musicians just loved, rip, slash, burn. We just loved it, and the collaborate. I need to say the collaboration, and often well-paid collaboration of some musicians with that hype. But the real reason we didn't fight back is because Spotify is not our employer.
Right.
YouTube is not our employer. In fact, they were insulated from us fighting back. They were doubly insulated, and I'll just give it another 30 seconds. They're doubly
By the
insulated
legislation.
because even on the level, we did have in the major labels, the much vilified and often for good reason, major labels are also the only unionized sector of the entire music industry, major label, major film. But the problem is, as with major label, there's another level of insulation going on there too, which is even before the digital thing, the unionized majors started to farm out their work to independent labels. Starting in the mid-'70s, they realized, they've had, due to a couple strikes in 1942 and 1948, the AFM shut it down and unionized the major labels, and those contracts are still in place, and they're great. They're fabulous. We want to talk about socialism, man. There's the special payments fund. All the major labels pay into a fund, based on how much they sold, but it's distributed evenly among all musicians who do work under that contract. So, based on how many hours you worked. So Taylor Swift's records are paying for a jazz musician under union contract that sold 5,000 copies. So there's some wonderful things about those contracts. The problem is they realized starting in the 70s, well, hey, if instead of producing it in-house, we distribute independently produced stuff, then we don't have to pay into all these union funds, no music performance trust fund, no special payments fund. We can license, we can distribute, and no one can do anything. They can't touch us. It's a Taft-Hartley violation. So
It's the same thing that we saw, many of you will know the story in the rest of the economy. The same thing was happening with production. The car companies got around UAW by using
Right.
third-party, parts makers and same kind of stuff. And we absolutely saw that in the music, with recorded music. And that's a story that I, think we need to we need to continue to tell because people don't know.
20 seconds and then I'll shut up about this. The difference between us, between musicians and the outsourcing in the auto industry, the only difference is that everybody thought it was cool. Our outsourcing to indie labels was marketed as an anti-corporate action. The indie labels were supposedly getting back at the man. So we, in a way, we became the cultural lube for everybody to get screwed during this by this outsourcing phenomenon.
I mean, I do think indie was a really sexy term for a while, and now it's started to become meaning estranged and exiled. But I mean, I followed really closely the issues related to higher education. And, you know, I relate to them on a level of, first of all, in terms of what I do for a living, that, yeah, if you like really devalue expertise and intellectual product, then you can truly devalue those workers. And that's happened in my profession. But, you know, in a similar way, I feel like there are two sides to what you're confronting. One side is organizing and direct action, and another side is raising consciousness. I mean, my consciousness has been raised in the past few years about what's facing those who work in higher education and at universities and colleges. And to me, that's why I think it is important for people to understand that, hey, most of what's on YouTube is theft, and it's protected by legislation that was created before we really even knew what the internet was, and that could and should be changed. That most of what happens in streaming is a serious devaluation for the very reason he said, because those owners and companies are way, way removed from you and your listeners, and they have very little interest in that. They just want to stay online. And that there's an idea that, well, yeah, if we live in a country where funding is up to certain foundations and not built into our structure, then it's a marketplace that has to function. So like, I wrote a lot about New Orleans after Katrina, after the flood that resulted from the levee failures that followed the hurricane. It's important to say it that way. And what I found was this economy of brass bands and all kinds of cultural workers who made a marginal living. But that marginal living was their living. And then it was just put below a red line. And then that's no longer functional or okay. And what's happening here is maybe a lot of musicians like you make more than a marginal living, but it was an economy that functioned in a small space, and it's been forced under a red line. So there has to be, if it's not going to be government funded, there has to be a different economy. There has to be a different, you know, all of you have to have a different place in that economy. So with that framing in mind, what can you do in terms of activism and organizing, or what needs to happen in terms of building awareness and on the part of people who hear your music? What we have ideas or suggestions that aren't bad ideas?
Oh, that was pretty simple. That was just to try to go after Spotify, you know. But when we were in the first year of the pandemic and that year of MWA, we were talking to we were trying to get advice as much as we could. We went to a lot of experienced union people, and we basically got a version of the same thing from each and every one of them. At the end of the day, they said, join the AFM and organize with the AFM. And you know, that may have been in part because folks didn't realize how difficult that may have been. Mark could tell you more about that. But I think it also came from a lack of understanding of the ways in which, you know, I mentioned that we're an organization of independent musicians, what that means structurally, how that is different. How, you know, although we share some of the experiences here of academic workers, there are important ways in which the structure of our work is different. You know, when I play on my friend's recording session last week, technically, according to the NLRB, I'm the employee, and he's the employer. and there's only 5 of us, and we're there for 1 day. So how are you going to unionize that? You know, so we have to really reckon with these issues, and you know, I'm not going to get into details, but those kinds of structural things really matter, and we need to think about them as they apply to us.
I think too, when around the pandemic, which is when I got involved with MWA, I guess to answer like how to get people involved, it's musicians were not used to being unionized, like especially independent, and so that was the appeal. The Music Workers Alliance, as being this worker center, is how to even gather people to do more actions and share through their experiences and turn it into direct action. You know.
Yeah, I think unionizing and organizing is the only way right now, and I would also go beyond just the recording part to also talk about wages of performances, how much people, you know, what's an appropriate fee for playing locally in your city or town, traveling a certain amount, let's say domestically, touring overseas, because performing rates have only also gone down, and the number of performance, like people used to go to Europe for 3 weeks or a month, you know, with 20 or 30 shows, and come home with enough money to live half the year or more on, let's say getting paid $1,000 per show. Well, now that rate has kind of stayed the same or gotten eroded down less and less, but the number of performances now, it's like people go to Europe and do 2 shows with 3 days off in between and come home with a couple $1,000, which after tax, after all the other expenses involved, not to mention the toll it takes on people's health to travel overseas, lose a day of sleep, jet lag, come back, jet lag. You know, it's a week or 10 days of sort of throwing off your entire life. If you have kids, you're paying for childcare, all these other, and this is just like basics existence as a performer. I mean, this is, nobody gets paid playing in their hometown. People generally travel in order to get paid. But again, in addition to all this unpaid labor, there's also the toll that it takes on people's health. So is there a way to increase those fees? I think they should be at least double what they currently are. And where is that funding going to come from? Because right now there's you know, it goes all the way up the chain, and we would all like to see, you know, 0.1% of the budget spent on the military going toward the arts, and we would all be doing very well right now. But that doesn't seem to be on the table in any of the legislatures or in their minds right now. So.
Good.
Testing. The way to increase those budgets is we should all be canvassing in Italy and Germany. Vote for the Social Democrats, at the very least. But I wanted to, you know, part of the answer to what we should do, I want to circle back to something that Sue Lin said earlier about not having a guide, not knowing, you know, what's normal. What's the rate for this? Like, I joined the Musicians Union in 1976 in Lewiston, Maine, for ideological reasons, really. All my rocker friends thought I was a nut, but I was well, I probably was, but I was also wobbly, and I thought, okay, I should participate in union activities. And so I've had I've watched what's gone on over the decades, you know, because union work has never been a majority of my income, but I wound up working with some rock stars and getting flown out to LA and doing union sessions, so I know what it is. I did 3.5 of my own records on major labels, so I know what it is to work under those contracts as a leader and a side musician. And what I've seen over the last, really it's been going on for 40 years now, what I saw was it started off, like the scenes I was on were never really unionized. If you got a major label deal, it was union, everything else was non-union. And like every now and then I'd try to make, you know, a stink about it if you read John Lurie's book, I'm the villain because I ruined his utopian vision because I asked for scale on Voice of Chunk and he fired me. But he paid the people who came after me much better, by the way. And I'm glad that this is going to be online, John. So, but the point is, what I saw happening was it went from a situation where before my time, almost all recording work was unionized. Then at the beginning of my time, some of it was, and very little club work was unionized, but there was a kind of collective memory of when it was, because union, pre-Taft-Hartley, all the clubs were unionized. So there was just a kind of, the club owners knew that if they were terrible to a certain, and musicians knew, even ones that had never worked under contract on either side, they knew if you did something really shitty and somebody said, yeah, I'm going to call in the union, it wasn't a joke. You know what I mean? There was some belief. So through the 70s and through the 80s, those concepts, the culture. So for about, I would say, 20, 25 years, we lived with no real threat of a union. The union did not organize any clubs during my I've joined Local 802 in 1979. I don't believe it has organized an indie club during my membership, okay? Or any club during my membership, or any indie label. So that's a long time. But for a long time, there was the culture of union. But eventually, the culture of union died out. The majority of musicians today do not know the union exists. In addition to MWA, there's Union of Musicians and Allied Workers who have never, MWA has tried to structure itself so that we can as a worker center that can play the kind of role with the AFM and with SAG-AFTRA that the Restaurant Opportunities Centers played with hotel employees, restaurant employees, and that Make the Road New York has played with the RWDSU, the Retail Workers Union, that we can be the kind of, we can be an outsourced union to respond to this post-Fordist strategy of outsourcing production. We can be an outsourced union. We can do the legally cutting edge, let's say, stuff, because we're not administering pension plans and health benefits plans, because we don't have 30 employees and we don't own a building. In fact, we don't have much of anything, In fact, and that's another story. I'm not going to give any. So that was the original idea. But now we're in a situation, the period of where you can rely on the cultural norms of unionism is finished. We either build it from the ground up or the whole thing goes under.
I want to throw a little more consciousness raising out there. And one thing is, there's been a lot of really good talk about how to support your neighborhood restaurants and sources of food through the pandemic, and don't let them die, and we must. And that's great, and I've been part of that. These artists and others feed us in other ways. They really do feed us. So post-pandemic, the attendance and ticket buying for live performances is way down. People do not want to leave their homes because now they've learned how to not leave their homes. If you want music and live arts to continue, go out there and support it the same way you might go out there and support your neighborhood restaurants. Because I will do some work at festivals and curating, and I've never seen anything like this. I could tell you names of famous elder statesmen who are not selling tickets, and it's not just a dip in the real estate business. This can go away the same way what I do, journalism, has pretty much gone away. And then I'm going to say the dirtiest four-letter F word that we know, which is free. So music, art, journalism, criticism, intellectual property should not be free. Why should it be free? Now, once you give it free, the drug is out there. So I face the thing where if I write something I'm proud of, people won't read it because there's a paywall and they don't know. The Times is letting me get it for free. Why can't you? Why should this be free? Why should their music be free? Okay, somewhere halfway between free and not free is you pay a monthly service charge to a streaming. You're no longer paying for Amir El Safar's album. You're paying, it's not free, but it's not exactly you're buying. Is what we make should be bought, and it should command some value in the marketplace. And consumers should demand that that economy exists, because if it doesn't, we don't go away, but we get flattened into this really weak, less than thing that you're not going to be happy with. I'm sorry, I got a little carried away there.
Well, we don't go away, but what we do is we become 99% people with independent wealth. And that's what we've seen.
Right.
That's what
that music
Yeah.
can be a thing you can do if you can afford to do it.
Right, and the thing that kills me, and that's the when we have a disagreement in MWA, that's like making me want to light my hair on fire and jump off a building or something. You know, the thing that brings me back to earth is the thought that what we're doing here is not even for myself. I mean, yes, it is for myself and out of some self-interest, but the idea that there's some genius out there whose music I don't know yet, and I don't know that I need, but it would have been made, but because it's so damn hard to be a musician,
Right.
they're never going to make it.
Or
And
that
I won't get to hear it.
that non-tenured professor or graduate student.
Exactly.
How many years did they work to be able to do what they're doing? How many years did you study and work to do what you're doing? That's part of the value.
I agree absolutely with everything that you've said about the injustice of working and the wrongness of, it's not so much free that's bad, it's free without the consent of the person who's giving it. Sometimes we might all want to do things for free, you know, but it's a question of consent. The thing is that the place that I want to avoid, the dead end, is usually often these discussions end with free is bad, buy our stuff on Bandcamp. Yes, by all means, buy our stuff on Bandcamp, but voluntaristic, so there is not voluntaristic solution to this problem. You can buy everything on Bandcamp. Everybody who listens to that argument can buy everything on Bandcamp. It will never be, Bandcamp will never be more than 4 or 5% of the market, ever. No one, we can't pretend that the solution is voluntaristic, people voluntaristically buying things that they can readily get for free. There's the solution. It's not true that once the things are out, the cat's out of the bag, the minute you know, the major online platforms are protected by a clause of Section 512 of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, which protects them from liability for streaming copyright violating content. The minute that goes away, the cat will be right in the bag. The minute somebody can sue YouTube because it's streaming something without content, there will be a market, and then we can unionize to get a piece of that market. But I think there are things that we can do, even if these laws, even if we are not protected by these laws. I think I was right when I was, 23 and was a wobbly. I think we all read and appreciated Jane McAlevy's book, in other words, the idea of going back to, there are no shortcuts and we need to go back to early, to CIO, early CIO organizing. I'm sorry, I think we need to go back further than that. We have been pushed back further than that, and we need to respond.
I want to open it to questions, but I also want to point out that Marc Ribot has a wonderful book called Unstrung that does a lot of things. One of the things it does, it tells you the story of that Haitian composer, but there's one chapter that actually frames a lot of these issues very, very concisely. So do we have any questions for our panelists? Okay.
You can talk about some of the organizing challenges in a completely deregulated market, right? I mean, I was with a friend last night, a musician who went to South by, who got no money. She got a wristband to be able to perform there. So I know UMAO has, tried to do something, and maybe they'll try to do something again, but you have a problem of, the employer problem is more than what you know what it is. So talk a little bit about how you're thinking about or struggling to think about the challenges of actually organizing to get agreements.
Well, one thing we're working on now is an arrangement that we would agree to as leaders and as side musicians, that we would make all recorded work under this format. And the idea here is that, sometimes we can get in the clouds about this, the money's not with our direct employer, and it's so complicated, and we have so many employers, and yeah, that stuff's important to keep in mind. But part of what Mark's also talking about is back to basics. We need to organize the point of production before we can even think about going beyond that. And right now, there's no standard. There's people recording for free with no promise of anything coming after it. So even if we recognize that most recordings are not going to have a lot of value, given a lot of the things we've been talking about, what we're working on right now is how can we organize it nonetheless. Do it in a way that the point of production is under a contract that will either guarantee you a fair amount of money, a fair scale, or will guarantee you a percentage of the value of that recording in the off chance that it does generate value. And often you don't know, if you play on 100 recordings in a decade, you don't know necessarily which one of those is actually going to blow up and be the next this or the next that. So that's what we're working on now, and I think that's a really important shift that we've all been working on that initiative. We're calling it the Scale Equity Contract between an artist, band leader, and side musicians. Right. Let me just say one more thing, which is that part of the theory here, and I'll admit that it's still somewhat theory, but is that once we have a critical mass of music in a given scene being made under this model, we can now approach indie record labels. And we can say, we are going to make the demand of you that you not license any music that is not made under one of these contracts. And once we have a critical mass of labels, we can go to digital distributors and say, we now demand of you that you not distribute any music that's not made. And once we have digital distributors, we can go to Spotify, and we can go to, and yes, we also have to change that Section 512 of the DMCA law. That's another thing. But once all of that happens, we're in business.
Yeah, Phil summarized it very well. I just want to add that there are we're working on right now, well, 2, maybe 3, we're going to figure that out tomorrow, contracts that are between the side, whoever's recording and the leader of the project, or if it's a band, then that puts that in contractual form, because I think as Sue Lin can tell us, there are a lot of people touring around in bands who say, I'm in the band, and they think that means they're in a collective.
Yeah, it's always like it's trying to eliminate the free for all. Like, you do the work and you're maybe expecting, or maybe there's like an unsaid pay, or potentially you do work and then you're empty-handed. Like, it's trying to correct that issue with a formal contract right off the bat, because I think musicians who are independent tend to not be protected, or maybe it's like an awkward exchange where you're trying to focus on the art, you're also negotiating. So I think it's a good solution, that trying to just formalize it and make it more direct.
Yeah. So there's a third thing that's not a contract, that's a pledge that is going to be between both lead and all musicians and MWA. And the pledge is going to say, I'm going to say when I sign it, I promise as a leader that all work I do is going to be under one of these fair contracts. And I promise as a side musician that all work I do, I'm going to demand one of these fair contracts and at the very least notify MWA if it has not been met, and I'm going to fight for it.
We have another question here.
This is for Amir. Sorry. You're producing world music, right? Your Iraqi music is world music.
If you want to call it that, sure. It's
That's
music
a-
from this
That's a
world.
different panel.
But yeah, sure. We'll
But I mean, it's not hip hop or
Sure.
blues or jazz. It's world music.
it can fit under, yeah, okay.
So are you familiar with Yo-Yo Ma's Silk Road project?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to back up a little bit and talk about music both from luck, talent, and audience. My sister-in-law recorded with Yo-Yo Ma. She doesn't speak a word of English. He doesn't speak a word of Portuguese. It was the Brazil project. They won 3 Grammys. She was here this past weekend, doesn't speak a word of English. Her repertoire was 14 songs from Antonio Carlos Jobim, and her backup musicians were Ron Carter and Kenny Barron. All sold out, all 4 shows. Not new music, old music. And for me to be successful, and this doesn't have to do with the union, it has to do with you as musicians. You have to have talent, you have to have luck, and you have to have an audience that's willing to buy your music. She was a cabaret singer in Brazil making $15 a night. Yo-Yo Ma went to Sony and said, I want to record world music because nobody's buying Beethoven, Bach, and Brahms. Crossover in world music is where things are going. So Yo-Yo Ma said, I want the best jazz singer in Brazil. Sony sent him 20 different recording artists, and he chose my sister-in-law. She had never heard of Yo-Yo Ma. Yo-Yo Ma had never heard of Rosa Passos. And she came to record this CD, Yo-Yo Ma, Obrigado Brazil. When they rehearsed, his background was classical music, very disciplined. Hers was jazz, all improvisational. He would say to her, Rosa, I can't follow you. What are you doing? And she said to Yo-Yo, don't worry about it. Just play your part of the track, and I'll play mine. And so it won 3 Grammys. Now,
She is a magnificent singer, and that was a very important. Was it last week that gig
yeah,
was?
no, this
Yeah.
past weekend.
Do you have a question for our panel?
No. What I'm saying is, the point is that you people are probably very talented, and you deserve a break, but you got to have luck to get up to the top. And being unionized, I'm not sure is going to make that difference. Okay. You've got to find somebody that's going to give you a break.
Thanks for the comment. Anyone have a comment to that?
Behind every star that you've heard of,
Yeah,
there is an army of people
right.
who are working, hundreds, if not thousands, behind every person who you can see as having had a break or reached star status. And in music, those people used to get paid, and now they don't. And we do need a union for that.
Right.
Thank you.
We do need a union for that, and life and survival needs, not only in music, but in education and in every field, not only to be owned by the stars.
Right.
It needs to be owned by everybody.
I'm glad you're
Thank you.
saying that.
Yes, and you know, one thing I've noticed as when we talk to, when we have meetings with folks who are not musicians, politicians sometimes, is that I feel this sense that they think of us as either hobbyists or rock stars, and that there's
Or
nothing
people
in
waiting
between.
for your lucky break.
Yes, perhaps. And that there's nothing in between. And I can tell you two kinds of people who their issues don't really matter and they don't need a union, hobbyists and rock stars. But there are a lot of people in the middle. And so, you know,
I think a nerve's been touched here. And I do think that the economy, the shift in the economy that we talked about for an hour here is a shift from an economy in which really talented, smart, sophisticated, enterprising musicians can have careers to a different economy where only projects with a recognizable household star name can make any money. And there aren't that many of them. Now, it just so happens that the star in question here is a magnificent musician and a wonderful statesman in the arts. But really, if you want an economy where people sit in a room and say, oh yes, everyone knows their name, so if you play with them, it's cool. Or you want one where it's like, hey, you're a great musician who could be building an audience and a career and not relying on luck, but actually relying on hard work and an infrastructure that doesn't disenfranchise you, that empowers you to at least, you know, luck is an ingredient in everyone's career, but we don't want a creative economy based on luck. Do we have a question for a panelist here? Maybe one more? Go ahead, go ahead. Go ahead. Sorry, got angry.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your coming and doing your music here and sharing all this. It's very moving to hear from artists and to just be around you. So that's not a question, that's just appreciation to begin with. But, you know, of course, the problem that you're describing is that you've got this structure which was never, the economic structure and the legal structure was never designed for you to be able to organize, right, to do gigs, et cetera. I mean, it was always designed legally to protect those who profit from it and to leave you impoverished, you know, with all of those kinds of, you know, the things we're just talking about, but it was making a living, right? And now it's the same issue of the legal and economic structure is designed to make sure that you are not going to make a living. And it's soul killing for the society, and it impoverishes everyone, and you are the ones who are directly paying for it. So, of course, what you're doing is correct. You have to organize. And I think the real question that I assume that, you know, you're always thinking about is, how do you organize? What risks are you willing to take to organize in a structure that's designed to keep you from doing that? And I think that's what, you know, when I think about it, that you keep pushing up against. And so I guess it's that question of when do you get to the numbers? When do you get to the critical mass so that people sign on and say, even in the face of this legal and economic structure, which is designed to keep us from doing this, we have the numbers, right? And so how do you do that? I don't know the answer, but I'd love to hear your thinking about it.
Well, I mean, there is a place for well, first of all, thank you for your kind words. There is a place for, I mean, there's certain risks that are unavoidable, but let's remember that we get together in order to reduce those risks, okay? And there are huge obstacles, but I want to push back against the myth that things have always been terrible. Things are bad because of specifics. Things are bad because the Taft-Hartley secondary boycott provision means that that once the majors started distributing indie labels instead of buying them and doing it in-house, that meant we couldn't go on strike against the majors. So there are specific laws, and even though the situation, so there are specific laws, and the truth is, what has always been the case is that there has always in the history of labor movements, been pushback and attempt by capital, by business, who have changed the legal environment or invented new technologies or done something to dispossess the labor movement. And our time is no exception. The reason we're screwed is not because capital invented post-Fordist restructuring. It's because the labor movement didn't push back. That's why we're screwed. So we have to circumvent in one way or another. I'm not going to, we're talking live, and some of the things I'm talking about are going to be on a need-to-know basis, you know. But the IWW existed in a condition of complete illegality. I mean, okay, it's different things in different states, but strikes themselves were illegal in most states, I believe, until 1935. Boycotts were illegal. Operations in constraint or restraint of free trade. The fact that it's an unfriendly legal, the labor movement has not always had there was a labor movement before the NLRA, and there will be one after it. And it's up to us to do it in a way that protects ourselves as much as possible, but to do it.
Want to have a last word?
Just, yeah, one final piece I just wanted to add that's in the context, but also maybe part of a larger context, which is what a creative artist, a creative musician, what their existence is in the world. Because there's often an idea, well, why don't you pick another career that's more lucrative, that's safer, that's more, I mean, we've heard it from our parents, and it's an old story. But I'll never forget the one time I met Gary Peacock. I was actually in a Zen Buddhist monastery in upstate New York, and we were supposed to be in silent meditation, and suddenly I looked across the room and there was Gary Peacock. And of course, monkey mind was, you know, going crazy for me. Like, oh my God, it's Gary Peacock. What am I going to say? I was 22 years old, and what am I going to say to him? But I sat down with him afterward. There was a lunch, and you know, we had a beautiful conversation. Mostly I was listening to him, but he said something to me about, to ask myself this question, do you have to be a musician? Because if the answer is no, or maybe, or I'm not sure, don't even put yourself into that. You're going to sacrifice too much of your own livelihood, of your own life energy, and it's a very difficult path, and it's not for everybody. But if the answer is yes, then you have no choice but to be a musician. And if you don't follow that impulse, it's going to ultimately be very destructive. And I've seen it in my life. I've seen, I mean, like Philip was saying earlier, I've seen people who, I saw a boy who was 12 years old playing the guitar, and someone said, oh, you know, Amir's a musician too. And I said, not like that. This boy was playing things I couldn't imagine. He'd only been playing for 2 or 3 years. He was such a mastermind musician. And then years later, I saw him going into other things and losing interest, and he committed suicide at 25. True story. And I think there are other stories that similar, where addiction, other things. So being a creative artist, musician is not a matter of choice. It's a matter of just we don't have the luxury of choice, and yet there isn't a role, unlike a factory or a corporation, where there are certain boxes that need to be filled with certain individuals that we don't necessarily. There's not a larger structure that's saying, okay, we need this person to fill this role. We have to also fight for our existence in the world, and make a case for why does our work need to exist? Why is my contribution of value? And all of these things that we're talking about are messages coming from the larger societal, you know, talk, but also financially and otherwise, saying, no, it's not valuable, it's not important, what you do is not worthwhile, you should be willing to accept whatever, you know. And because we're so, our lives depend on being musicians, not just livelihood, but just our existence, we're often willing to accept and let ourselves be exploited in the worst possible way, just so that we can be able to perform and do the thing that we exist on this world, in this plane to do. So it's a very particular predicament of the creative in this world, but I think it's something that needs to be said and reminded in in this particular context as well.
Thanks. I think that is a beautiful and potent note to end on. And so we're going to have to end, but I'm hoping this filters out into a larger conversation that resonates with all the other panels and that resonates with why we, who aren't making the music, need that music, those arts just as much. And they can be supported by something other than a handout and a pat on the head. Please help me thank these 4 magnificent musicians, and thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. So.